So what are the liabilities in tort? Generally, each person is liable for his or her own torts. So what happens, what we are saying is that generally you are liable for your own torts. I am liable for my own. But there are circumstances that another person may be held liable for torts committed by another. And this is what we mean by vicarious liability. And it tends to occur in employer-employee relationships. When another person is liable, what do we need to establish? That there must be a master-servant relationship, and the servant must have been acting in the course of employment at the material time. So again, we ask ourselves, who is a servant? And we need to do the control test. A servant is someone who the master has control over. That is, there's a contract of service, and their own judgment is not brought into question. There's a difference between someone, an independent contractor, and someone employed over a contract of service. An independent contractor, you're supposed to use your own judgment. Someone under contract of service, essentially you are told what to do, when to do, and how to do this. Take, for instance, the bank employees or any other employees. You're given the stipulated time on when you should arrive in work. You're also given your duties, whether you are a teller, you're the operations manager, you're the branch manager. You're also given the hours which you need to work in a week, the leave days you're entitled to, and if anything happens, given reporting structure. But an independent contractor will set his own timeline, will set his own guidelines, and he will follow them through. And the nature of the employment test is someone who has a contract service, you are an employee. That is an employment contract where you sign that you have applied for this job, you've been accepted, this is your pay, this is what you're entitled to. You may get bonuses, you get 21 leave days, or others depending on your workplace. Essentially, there's a contract. And we ask ourselves, what is the course of employment? Acts done under the course of employment, and it is proven that they were authorized by the master, then that employer will be liable for them, for those acts he actually authorizes, and even though expressly forbidden by the employer. And what happens is term in common law into contracts of employment, an employee asks that we have signed this contract. We should take reasonable care at all times and employ our skills that we use to get this job during the course of employment. A job is advertised, and there are the requirements: academic, professional. There are also skills that are required of you. So the assumption is, once you get the job, you use those requisite skills to do this job to the best of your abilities, as well as not be negligent in any way. So what happens when you're negligent in pursuing your duties? We go back to the example of the bank teller and a customer. So a customer comes and wants to withdraw money from an account. as the bank teller for proof of identity. Whose account is this that you need to withdraw from? And the customer provides probably the ATM and an identity card. So what happens when the teller does not his identification and proceeds to allow the customer to access the account and withdraw cash? He will have acted negligently and he will be liable for his own misdeeds. So the employer is liable if he has authorized the commission of that. And this, we talk of Ellis versus Sheffield Gas. The defendant had no authority to open up the street. Yet they employed a contractor to open trenches and lay gas pipes. So when the contractor left a heap of stones, the defendants were liable since the contract was an illegal act. If it was okay for them to dig up the streets, then the defendant would not be liable. This is what we are talking about. We also talk about strict liability. We were talking about vicarious, where someone is responsible for the acts of another. But in strict liability, this is fault-based liability. That is liability without fault. And we distinguish strict liability from absolute liability. In absolute liability, a particular wrong is actionable without fault, and there is no defense available to the wrongdoer. But in strict liability, the wrongdoer has a number of defenses available to him. And for strict liability, we talk of the Ryland versus Fletcher case. And in this, the defendant owned a mill and constructed a reservoir on their land. The reservoir was placed over the mine, whose passages communicated with draining mine of the plaintiff. The defendant was not aware of this fact and therefore took no precaution against it. Water from the reservoir filtered through to the disused mine shafts and then spread to a working mine owned by the claimant, causing extensive damage. So what was held? The defendants were strictly liable for the damage caused by an unnatural use of land. It didn't matter that there was no fault on their part, and it didn't matter that they didn't know. So Lord Cranworth explains behind the rule behind the Ryland versus Fletcher case. If a person brings or accumulates on his land anything which, if it should escape, may cause damage to his neighbor, does so at his own peril. If it does escape and cause damage, he is responsible, however careful he may have been and whatever precautions he may have taken to prevent the damage. This rule is regarded as a type of nuisance, but it is a strict liability in that the defendant may be liable in the absence of any negligent conduct on their part. We had talked about the element of negligence being part of, negligence is a very important part of tort law, where a duty of care was owed and a breach was done. In strict liability, we are saying where you introduce an unnatural use of land and it accumulates and it causes mischief. Ideally, you are not, there's no need for anyone to prove negligence. Whether you knew that water could overflow, it stops to matter. and you're held liable. You must remember this is a general rule, and we will go through it. We'll finish up on that. Let's go back to trespass. Liabilities in tort are either vicarious liability or strict liability. The rule in Rylands versus Fletcher.